Welcome to the Center for the Restoration of Christian Culture. I'm Dr. William Fahey, the president of Thomas More College. Very happy to welcome back most of you. Looking around the room, this is a little bit like a party at the Fahey house. Lots of familiar faces tonight, but some newcomers. Introducing Joseph Pearce is a little bit strange because I think most people came because they knew Joseph was in town and speaking tonight. What does one say about the man who's written over 30 books? Well, I found a napkin that had some notes, so I'll just read that. Really, the only thing the only two or three important things that you don't know about Joseph, many of you, is that this year he will be coming back 8 more times, or I think this is you'll be coming back 8 more times. This is the first of 8 lectures on Catholic history. So Joseph is our St. John Henry Newman Visiting Chair of Catholic Studies. We love these long titles at Thomas More College of Liberal Arts at the Center for the Restoration of Christian Culture. So Joseph is our, thanks to the generosity of one of our donors, we have an endowment fund that is restricted to bringing in visiting scholars and writers and teachers. And this year, Joseph will be coming in regularly, both to teach at the college, but also to deliver a series of lectures this year on Catholic history. And so I officially welcome Joseph in that capacity, although I've been honored to know Joseph for years. The lectures will run from tonight until April 17th. They're all posted on our website. They're, I believe, all at 7:30. They'll follow a similar format to this evening. The next one is November 14th. The others you can look up, but November 14th, Christ to Constantine, and then we're off to the races. April 17th. I have to get you to stay to the 23rd so we can celebrate the Feast of St. George together. But April 17th, the Wars of Irreligion. I think that's the grand finale.
That's the grand finale.
The grand finale. So please don't miss that. For those of you who don't know that Joseph Pearce is the celebrated author of over 30 books, then I invite you after the lecture to step into Joseph's booth, where some of those books will be found, and we'll try to make sure we're stocked through the entire lecture series. So if we run out, and we've already sold a number of books today for earlier events, we'll restock. So if there's a book that you want Joseph to sign it, don't worry. But after the lecture, Joseph will be available to sign books, sell books, and there will be a short reception. Short reception. I repeat, a short reception. It's a school night. Without further ado, Joseph Pearce.
Well, it's a joy to be here, as always. I love Thomas More College, and it's good to be part of the community throughout the coming school year here at Thomas More College. I do have just one bone to pick with the president of the college, so perhaps this will be the last time you see me, actually, because he just called that my booth. That's not a booth. When you walk through that door, it's a magic wardrobe. And you might find something in there which will change your life. But I'll be in there happily, and one thing William didn't mention, apart from being happy to sign books, and I hope there's somebody to help me sell them, otherwise I'll scramble, but also to answer any questions. So I think we'll have time for a short Q&A. But either way, if we don't get to your question in the Q&A, I'm happy to answer questions individually during the period out there. All right, so we're starting a new history series here on the history of Christendom. It's the title we're given to the series, but it's based upon the book I finished about a month or so back, which will be published next year. The title I've given to that is The Good, the Bad, and the Beautiful, History in Three Dimensions. So I want to explain, and before I do that, I want to just go through quickly the other titles of the lecture series. Dr. Fahey mentioned one or two. So the title of tonight's opening lecture, which is an introduction to the history of Christendom, in the terms of the series of the book and a series of lectures and the book itself. So that's The Good, the Bad and the Beautiful, History in Three Dimensions, which is the title of the book, it's the title of the lecture. And then the second one will be From Christ to Constantine, the Early Church. And the third will be The Death and Resurrection of Rome, the 5th to the 10th century. And then The Best and Worst of Times, the 11th to the 13th century. Then Rupture and Reformation, the 14th to the 16th centuries. And then Religion and Superstition, 17th and 18th century. And Revolution, Revelation and Revival, 19th century. And finally, Wars of Irreligion, 20th century. What I'm actually doing in the lecture series is reneging on the whole philosophy of the book in terms of form. Because the purpose of the book was to stop what tends to happen in history where the further things get away from us, the less we talk about them. Now, there's a good reason for some of that, of course, because we have fewer sources. There's less, we know less. So if you know less, you obviously have no choice but to say less. But what I want to try to do with the book is to give one chapter for each of the 20th centuries, for each of the 20 centuries, so that each period is getting real-time equal space, to try to give an understanding of history based upon the real-time experience of it rather than our truncated perception of it. And so that was one idea of it. So the book has an introduction, an opening chapter, and then one chapter on each of the 20th centuries and a concluding epilogue. So this is going to be based upon the introduction and the first chapter of the book. So at the beginning of the book, I introduce it by talking about, and it's obviously an allusion to the title of the book, The Good, the Bad and the Beautiful, not to the good, the true and the beautiful, which you might expect, but to the good, the bad and the ugly, by which I refer to Sergio Leone's famous spaghetti western. And the purpose of that, according to Sergio Leone himself, was a satire on the Wild West and the romanticism of the Wild West, and a deconstruction of that whole romance. So it's something meant to undermine. So the way of looking at it is, the Clint Eastwood in that film, and for that matter, all the other major characters, are what are now known as anti-heroes. They deconstruct and contradict the sort of the archetypal Wild West hero as epitomized in numerous films by John Wayne. So Clint Eastwood versus John Wayne. And I say, as the good, the bad, and the ugly is not a good title for the book, for the movie, because there are no good characters in it. The real title should be the bad, the worse, and the ugly. So what we find in this understanding of the West, is New World naivete, John Wayne, versus Old World cynicism, Sergio Leone. And to me, this was summed up in a novel by Graham Greene, not one that most people know as well as some of the more obvious, but he wrote a novel called The Quiet American. And it's set in French Indochina, which, for those who know your history, became known as Vietnam, and in the 1950s. And it's part of the French colonial thing at the time. But the two main characters, someone called Fowler, who's a jaded, middle-aged, cynical English journalist. His name Fowler actually is maybe even appropriate. But then there's also this young, naive American member of the CIA, who's sort of neoconservative, everything American is as good as it gets. And they both have desires over the same woman. So what you have is this old world cynic and this new world naive person and their perspective on things. And I wrote something years ago, an essay on the Quiet American, and obviously neither is ideal. But I did say if you forced me to choose, I'd choose New World naivete over Old World cynicism. So, but here, the Wild West, in that film, is a euphemism for the Old West. All that is chivalrous. Now, John Wayne, in some sense, is a knight in shining armour who is always fighting for the side of good against the bad guys. So that is deconstructed. So the Old West is the Old West. The Old West is Christendom. The true West is Christendom. And the thing about Christendom is Christocentrism, that at the centre of culture in Christendom is Christ. And again, I can occasionally quote passages from the book. So this is from the prologue, The Three Dimensions of History. At the heart of all healthy societies and cultures is the presence of the good, the true, and the beautiful. This triune presence is perfected in the person of Christ, who is, as he tells us, the way, the truth, and the life. He is the way of goodness, which is to say that he embodies the fullness of virtue made manifest in love. He is the truth, which is to say that he is the end to which all properly ordered reason points, and he is the very life of beauty, which is to say that he shines forth the glory of creation as the Word made flesh, as the poem which perfectly reflects the perfection of the poet. Since this is so, it can be seen that the more that Christ is present in the soul of a culture or society, the more will such a society or culture truly reflect the goodness, truth, and beauty of his image. Conversely, his absence leads to the way of evil, to the deconstruction and destruction of truth in the living of the lie, and to the killing of life in the culture of death and its cult of ugliness. So what I try to show in the book is that history is a tapestry. So it's not something progressing towards a golden age in the future or something regressing from a golden age in the past. There's no golden age in the past. There's no golden age in the future. The only golden age in the future is the golden age in heaven. There's no golden age in time. Don't seek it there. It's not where it belongs. There's not going to be heaven on earth. But history is a tapestry which is time-stitched and weird woven. So imagine history as a tapestry, and it's a tapestry of three threads: the good, the bad, and the beautiful. Hence the title of the book. And what I mean by weird woven is that our modern word weird just means odd or strange or Halloween, right? But actually in Old English, weird or weird, W-Y-R-D, actually is more akin to a sort of mystical understanding of the proactive role of providence in the life of people and societies. You talk about the weird woven web. And the idea is, and it's often, by the way, when the word weird is used in Anglo-Saxon poetry, such as Beowulf, the word weird is normally translated as fate. And although that word might be appropriate to paganism, it's not appropriate to Old England, Anglo-Saxon England, which was profoundly Catholic. I wrote another book, by the way, which I imagine is on sale in there, called Faith of Our Fathers, A History of True England, where there's 2 chapters in Anglo-Saxon England, a profoundly Catholic culture. When the Anglo-Saxon poets use the word weird, they don't mean fate or fortune, something mechanistic and impersonal. They mean divine providence, but in a way in which it's woven like a web, that everything we do has consequences to other people in the web. There's nothing we can do which is in isolation. Everything has consequences. So virtuous actions have virtuous consequences in a domino effect. Vicious actions have vicious consequences in a domino effect. So the weird woven web. So history as a tapestry of 3 threads, the good, the bad, and the beautiful, which are time-stitched, stitched by time, and weird woven by the web of providence, God's presence in time. So those 3 threads, the good, the bad, and the beautiful. And I know that last time I spoke about this already, so I'm going to say it briefly. But the good is homo viator in society, pilgrim man on the quest. The bad is homo superbus, the proud man, presence of pride, theologically understood. And the beautiful is anthropos, he who looks up in wonder. So the pilgrim man, the proud man, and the poet, if you like, are the 3 aspects of who we are as human beings. And as human history is a human thing, it is, of course, going to reflect who we are as human persons. So that's why the theme, the thesis is as it is. So again, to read from the text, These three threads weave their way through the hearts of each and every person, forming the tapestry which reveals the pattern of their individual lives. In consequence, these same threads weave their way through the collective lives of men, which we call history. They are the three dimensions of history itself. In every generation, the virtuous find themselves living as exiles in a vale of tears, witnessing to the goodness of love, even unto death, in a world of sin and sorrow dominated by viciousness. In the midst of this never-ending interwoven battle between good and evil is also woven the indomitable power of beauty, both in the grandeur of God, to be seen in the beauty of creation, and also in the glory of God's creative presence in the beauty of great art. So again, the structure of the book, every chapter on every century is divided into three sections. The good, so the lives of the saints, and other good things are done by people who are not necessarily saints. So, we might talk about good things that were done by Charlemagne or Alfred the Great. So the good, the bad, so the vicious, the secular, the Judas figure in the church, and then the beautiful. What great works of visual art, music, literature, architecture, the sculpture that manifest in each century. So it's sort of an interwoven history of the church, history of the saints, history of the secular world, and a history of art. But interwoven as a tapestry, so we can see the three side by side in a chronological panorama landscape. But all of it is to bear in mind that, as Tolkien said, history is the long defeat with only occasional glimpses of final victory. So you see in every century that the bad, certainly in terms of politics, in terms of power, are dominant almost always. The good are a minority, and often as not a persecuted minority. And the beautiful are candles shining in an otherwise dark world. The light of beauty. Now, the inspiration of the book originally came from some words of Pope Benedict XVI. And when I read these, it's when the whole vision, the whole idea of this book was inspired, so I owe it to him. And these are his words that set the whole project in motion. The only real effective apologia for Christianity comes down to two arguments, namely the saints the Church has produced and the art which has grown in her womb. Better witness is borne to the Lord by the splendour of holiness and art which have arisen in the community of believers than by clever excuses which apologetics has come up with to justify the dark sides which sadly are so frequent in the Church's human history. If the Church is to continue to transform and humanise the world, how can she dispense with beauty in her liturgies, that beauty which is so closely linked with love and with the radiance of the resurrection? No, Christians must not be too easily satisfied. They must make their church into a place where beauty, and hence truth, is at home. Without this, the world will become the first circle of hell. So that their words that were basically almost, except for one other paragraph, finish the prologue of the book, which sets the, if you like, the philosophy of the approach to history that the book takes. So Benedict XVI is an inspiration, and I thank him for it. But then the first chapter, so I said every chapter is going to be on a century. But I had to not cheat, but there's obviously one particular century or one particular third of a century which trumps all the others. And that's the first third of the first century of the life of Jesus Christ. And that really is the template, it's the pattern of the whole tapestry is set in place during the life of Christ. The gospel is the pattern that we see played out in history. So in principio, in the beginning. So at the beginning of chapter 1, which is called Life, Death and Resurrection, I begin with quotes from Scripture. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. The very first thing that we need to know about history is that it is worded into being. Its pattern pre-exists it in eternity. It is made manifest in what we call time by the word of God and the will of God, in whom and in which there is no past and no future, only omnipresence. To the one who patterns it, Alexander the Great and Alfred the Great are equally present, even though in terms of time they lived more than 1,000 years apart. To our finite and time-bound perception, this is of course a mystery. History is, therefore, a mystery. It needs to be seen in the light by which it exists. And God said, "Let there be light." And there was light. And God saw the light, that it was good. None of this would be known or indeed knowable unless God himself had revealed it. This he does in the person and the incarnation of Jesus Christ. It is in Christ that God reveals himself to man. And it is also in Christ that God reveals man to men. Christ shows us in himself the perfect man to whose perfection we are called to strive, and he reveals to us in his life, death, and resurrection the very template of the pattern of history. And the Word was made flesh and dwelt among us. So this is the template. And I'm going to read on now from that chapter and then comment upon it as we go. In his revelation of himself as the way, the truth, and the life, we have seen that Christ reveals himself as the good, the true, and the beautiful. When he commands us to follow him, he calls us to love one another as he has loved us. When he tells us to take up our cross in order to follow him, we are shown that love is inseparable from self-sacrifice, demanding the death of the self for the good of the other. So this is homo viator, pilgrim man, man on a quest, man on adventure. He shows us that love comes at a great price, which we must be willing to pay. The way of Christ is therefore the way of the cross. There is no other way except the way of refusal. Homo superbus, the proud man, the way of refusal. The acceptance of the cross is the thread of goodness or sanctity which weaves its way across the centuries. The refusal of the cross is the evil thread, which ironically and paradoxically is the very cause of the suffering which he refuses to accept. So again, we see in Homer and Sophocles and Chesterton's Manners Thursday particularly, Sophocles' Oedipus cycle, both of Homer's epics, this truth that those who spend their life trying to avoid suffering end up suffering than those who embrace it. And that shouldn't surprise us because we are all going to suffer. It's just some of us will accept the suffering and ask Christ to help us carry our crosses, and others will refuse to accept the suffering and try to carry the burden in isolation. Maurice Baring, in his novel Darby and Joan, and in the words of a priest character, said that the acceptance of sorrow is the secret of life. When you understand that, you will understand everything. So not suffering, not sorrow, but the acceptance of sorrow and suffering, the acceptance of the cross. In this sense, the whole of humanity and the whole of human history can be seen to be present at Golgotha on either side of Christ, in the presence of the good and bad thief. The one is repentant, accepting his suffering. The other is unrepentant, resenting his suffering. One accepts the cross, the other refuses it, but both are crucified. The good and the bad are both crucified. Nobody escapes the crucifixion. Golgotha shows us that there is no escape from suffering. It's simply what we choose to do with it. This is the pattern of good and evil, which is weird woven throughout history by the choosers and refusers of the cross. But what of the third thread? What of beauty? As with the acceptance of the cross, it is inseparable from humility. St. Thomas Aquinas teaches that we can only see the fullness of reality, which is God and his presence in creation, if we possess the virtue of humility. It is humility that gives us the sense of gratitude, that opens the eyes in wonder, and it is only with eyes wide open with wonder that we are moved to the contemplation which leads to the opening of the mind and soul into the fullness of the beauty of God's presence in creation. Again, for those of you that know Gerard Manley Hopkins's poetry, for instance, God's grandeur, the world is charged with the grandeur of God. And Hopkins talks about the whole of creation. Everything you see in terms of God's creation has its inscape. Not just the landscape, the exterior that you can see, but God's spiritual presence as the life of beauty within it. And that's as applicable to inanimate objects like a sunset as it is to a tree. The life is not organic, the life is spiritual. It's the presence of God in his creatures. But it takes one with the eyes wide open in wonder to contemplate that and then be opened into its presence. Anthropos, he who looks up. We will only follow Christ if we see him as the Son of God and acclaim him as such. If our eyes are wide open with wonder, we will see that he is not merely a man, but is our Lord and our God. It is the scribes, Pharisees, and hypocrites with their eyes shut in pride who refuse to believe the word of God even when he is in their midst. It is they who see only the man and not the God, and it is they who demand that the man be crucified, not that he be adored. They are blind to the beauty dwelling among them. Returning to Christ's revelation of himself as the way, the truth, and the life, we can see that beauty is the life of Christ in both the beholder of beauty and in the beauty beheld. Without such life, our pride and prejudice make us blind. This is evident in the way that we perceive the gospel, which, as we have seen, is the very template of the pattern of history. It is only if we see the ugliness of the crucifixion from the perspective of the beauty of the resurrection that we can perceive the fullness of the life of Christ, which defeats death itself. Life, death, and resurrection. Life, the good. The death, the crucifixion, the bad, although you see it through the light of the beautiful, the resurrection, even the crucifixion is transfigured. Where was I? Without this Christ life, we see only death. And if we see only death, it is because we are not alive. Without this Christ light, we see only darkness. And if we see only darkness, it is because we are blind. The problem is not with the life or the light, but with the lifeless blindness of the one who fails to behold it. In seeing the crucifixion in the light of the resurrection, we are also seeing the long defeat of human history, awash as it is with wickedness, in the light of the final victory which Christ has already won. This is the light and life which illumines and animates the three dimensions of history. Now I'm going to skip here that's the end of chapter 1, basically making the gospel the pattern for the tapestry, the template by which all of history needs to be understood and judged. But every chapter, what I want to do, as I said, is that on the good, the bad, and the beautiful. Well, the first chapter, that doesn't follow that pattern, but the first century, from the death and resurrection of Christ onwards, 33 AD to 99 or 100 AD, I'll be talking about the good and the bad next time, but I wanted to talk about the beautiful, part of that section of the chapter, because it's the most beautiful. So you can understand, by the time you get to the Renaissance, if you're trying to write a book of this sort, it's a challenge, to keep the discussion of the beautiful down to around 1,000 words. The aim was, try to make them bite-sized chunks, each chapter readable, user-friendly. So the ideal was 3,000 words or not much more, certainly between 3 and 4. When you get the Renaissance, how on earth do you have 1,000 or 1,500 words on the 15th century with great difficulty? But that's not a problem with the first century in terms of art. We don't have that much of a record of, certainly no music, not much visual art. So there's not a great deal to write about, but the most beautiful work of art ever belongs to the first century. So that's the focus of the final section of chapter 1 of the first century. We'll return to the first century in the next lecture for the good and bad aspects of it. I just want to conclude the lecture with this section from the chapter on the first century. The beautiful, let's say that's the subheadings. If Christ's self-revelation as the way, the truth, and the life is a manifestation of the transcendental trinity of the good, the true, and the beautiful, we are able to see beauty itself as the life of Christ in both the beholder beauty and in the beauty beheld. In this light, we can see that the beauty of Christ is made manifest most especially in the sacraments that he initiated. It's the great works of art of the first century, the 7 sacraments. Since it is through sacramental grace that the life of Christ becomes present to his followers in all ages, we can see the sacraments as the spiritual conduit through which the beauty of Christ becomes present in history. Without them, the world would be bereft of all true beauty and all true goodness, or at any rate, it would be bereft of those able to behold such beauty. The Christ life made present in the sacrament is therefore the very light by which we see and the life by which we live. Such sacramental beauty is present preeminently in the Eucharist, through which the Church is revealed in the New Testament as the body of Christ. As Cardinal Ratzinger reminds us, quote, "One is Church and one is a member thereof, not through a sociological adherence, but precisely through incorporation in this body of the Lord through baptism and the Eucharist." End quote. Furthermore, as Ratzinger explains, it is through this Eucharistic presence that Christ is present in his church. A longer quote from Ratzinger. So let no one say the Eucharist is for eating, not looking at. It is not ordinary bread, as the most ancient of traditions constantly emphasize. Eating it, as we have just said, is a spiritual process involving the whole man. Eating it means worshipping it. Eating it means letting it come into me so that my I is transformed and opens it up into the great we, so that we become one in him. Thus, adoration is not opposed to communion, nor is it merely added to it. No, communion only reaches its true depths when it is supported and surrounded by adoration. The Eucharistic presence in the tabernacle does not set another view of the Eucharist alongside or against the Eucharistic celebration, but simply signifies its complete fulfillment. For this presence has the effect, of course, of keeping the Eucharist forever in the Church. The Church never becomes a lifeless place, a lifeless space, but is always filled with the presence of the Lord, which comes out of the celebration, leads us into it, and always makes us participants in the cosmic Eucharist. What man of faith has not experienced this? A church without the Eucharistic presence is somehow dead, even when it invites people to pray. But a church in which the eternal light is burning before the tabernacle is always alive, is always something more than a building made of stones. In this place, the Lord is always waiting for me, calling me, wanting to make me Eucharistic. In this way, he prepares me for the Eucharist, sets me in motion toward his return. Beautiful words of Cardinal Ratzinger. Although Cardinal Ratzinger's words refer to the presence of the Eucharist in individual tabernacles and individual churches, they apply, of course, to the Eucharistic presence in the Church herself throughout all the centuries, from the first to the last. In other words, the most important thread of beauty in all 20 centuries is the Eucharistic presence, which obviously is established in the first. Taking the Cardinal's words and applying them to history, we can say that history never becomes a lifeless space as long as the Eucharist is present, but is always filled with the presence of the Lord. The presence of the Eucharist in history makes history itself and all those participating in it participants in the cosmic Eucharist. It makes time a participant in eternity. It makes the past and the future coeval with God's omnipresence. History without the Eucharistic presence is somehow dead. It is Christ present in the sacrament who gives life. It is he who makes all things new and all things beautiful. It is his Eucharistic presence in all ages which, as J.R.R. Tolkien proclaimed, is the one great thing to love on earth. And I finish this chapter with Tolkien's words about the Eucharist. Out of the darkness of my life, I put before you the one great thing to love on earth, the Blessed Sacrament. There you will find romance, glory, honour, fidelity, and the true way of all your loves upon earth, and more than that, death. By the divine paradox, that which ends life and demands the surrender of all, and yet by the taste or foretaste of which alone can what you seek in your earthly relationships, love, faithfulness, joy, be maintained or take on that complexion of reality, of eternal endurance that every man's heart desires. Thank you. Okay, do we have any questions? We have Eucharistic silence, if you like. Yes.
Where is that last quote from?
I can remember. It's a letter that Tolkien wrote to one of his sons, I think. It's published in the letters of J.R.R. Tolkien. I finished my book Tolkien, Man and Myth with that quote with a footnote, so it's just over there. I'll give you the exact details, including the page number, but I can't give you that from here. Yes?
I'm just curious about what you would say would be the primary purpose of history, and if there are secondary purposes, what would you think they are?
What a great question. Are you a college student? The primary purpose of history, and if so, what are they? Well, yes, the primary purpose of history is for the war to be fought between God and Satan in time, that we may be with God forever in heaven. In other words, it's the battleground of the church militant. So all of history points towards Christ, and everything's happened since he came also points towards Christ. He's the centre of history. He's the purpose of history. Being true to him as the Lord of history is our purpose and our quest in life, to be homo viator. But to understand that this is a very the time, history, is a very temporary thing, not just temporal but temporary. First of all, in terms of the cosmic understanding of God's omnipresence and eternity, but also in terms of the very minuscule amount of history of which we are actually a part. Now, the proverbial 70 years and 10, the lifespan of a person. That's our active tour of duty. But the whole purpose of it is to cross the finishing line. So the purpose of history is to show us the finishing line, and the history itself is the battleground by which we reach it by the grace of God, and it's impossible without the grace of God. So that's the primary purpose of history. Has I also asked the second part or not?
Yes, well, I was wondering if you thought there were maybe other purposes besides, of course, being like Christ-centered, right, and for the glory of Christ. Maybe practical purposes of history. I don't know if you have any thoughts on that.
Well, ultimately, history is fought out between the good and the true, and beautiful is the manifestation of the good. And that's the whole point. I'm trying to show that history, things are the tapestry. If you went back before Christ, that the pattern would look a little bit different. It would still be basically the same thing, though. Virtue was still virtue before Christ. Viciousness was still viciousness before Christ, and beauty was still beauty before Christ. But not because Christ didn't exist. Christ still existed. That's why the pattern's the same. But he hadn't fully revealed himself. So the aspects of goodness, the understanding of the cross and what that meant, the embrace of suffering in a different way. The pagan Greeks had an understanding of the necessity of accepting suffering, but not in terms of the cross, not in terms of the resurrection. So of course the pattern is well, I could say radically changed. No, the pattern is enriched beyond recognition, but it's in place before that because Christ is in place before that. C.S. Lewis, I quoted this earlier today in class and in one of the other talks, that C.S. Lewis talked about the difference between the old pagans from before Christ and the so-called neo-pagans of today, in terms of the old pagans were like the virgin awaiting the coming of the bridegroom, whereas the new pagans are like divorcees who have walked away from the marriage. So there's a big difference. But the point is that if the virgin is awaiting the bridegroom's present, even if he hasn't shown himself. So in other words, the whole of history, including before Christ, manifests Christ. The purpose of history is Christ. The time is something created by Christ as much as an oak tree is, and our part in time is to get to Him. That's our purpose. There is no other. I mean, everything else is utilitarian means to do that,
Thank you so much.
or to fail to do that. Yes. Yeah.
You talked about acceptance of suffering, and I can't remember which quote you said it was, but that the acceptance of suffering or sorrow is the secret to life. Do you think, and I'm saying this in the sort of this liturgical space between St. Teresa of the Little Flower and St. Teresa of Avila's feast days, do you think that we're maybe even asked to go further and to not just accept suffering, but to welcome it?
Yes, and as I said in the lecture and parts of the book, I was quoting from the lecture. I should call it a manuscript rather than the book. It's not published yet. We're called to be perfectly human, which means we're called to be like Christ. So that's the perfection to which we're called. Now, to the extent to which we can achieve that, of course, is another matter. And even Christ, in his human aspect, found the suffering difficult. So I wrote a book about Father Ho Lung and the missionaries of the poor, and he's sometimes called the male Mother Teresa, their motto is joyful suffering with Christ on the cross. Not contemplating Christ on the cross, but asking to be with him on the cross. That's a level of holiness that many of us may never reach, but it certainly is something to which we are called if we will be as Christ is. So yes, we should welcome suffering. We can even go further and say that perhaps in some sense we should seek it. But it's dangerous, because if we start saying things like that, we don't actually have the sanctity, then that can be cause of psychosis. Also, in other words, our pride is warping us into a false sense of piety and perfection. So it's best to be on our knees in all things and then accept and embrace the gifts that we're given in consequence. And we may find that we are now able to accept and even welcome suffering. But if we try to welcome it, that's the sin of Pelagianism. It has to be the work of God.
tapestry? Would she be amongst the good or the beautiful or both?
She wouldn't be part of the bad, that's for sure. Again, there's mention. I can't remember the chapter of the book now. But there, as obviously, the Blessed Virgin plays a major role in history, and certainly in the development of the Christian Church's understanding of itself, which is made manifest in the first centuries, especially. And her, the role of the Blessed Virgin in the Church's understanding of herself. So that's a fairly significant part in both the good and the beautiful of those early chapters. I haven't got there yet. I talk about the life, death, and resurrection of Christ, the gospel story, as the template, and of course the Blessed Virgin and her own fiat is a very important part of that template, that initial pattern. So she certainly weaves her immaculate presence through the whole of history in both the good and the beautiful thread. Yeah.
You mentioned the Eucharist as the ultimate art form. I'm assuming that throughout your book you maintain that, you maybe continue to remind the reader of that, but at the same time I'm wondering how you tackle the subject of art as it becomes more and more important part of Christendom, and whether that was challenging to write about by also keeping this perspective of, it's beautiful, but it's not the thing. I'm also wondering if you could touch upon maybe a little sneak preview of how you address the Reformation, maybe depicting that as maybe a direct attack on the Eucharist or just a rejection or.
Well, I'm going to ask people to wait till we get the appropriate time part of the story, rather than give spoilers up front. And if you can't get to the later lectures, then obviously you can buy the book when it comes out. But the other question, well, the thing you have to understand is the biggest challenge of the book actually was the necessity of brevity. So no, I don't, bring back the Eucharist as a recurring motif, as in music, and the Blessed Virgin. I mean, they appear in terms of where, if there's some manifestation, so the definition of the Immaculate Conception or the appearance of the Blessed Virgin at Lourdes, so there's those appearances in time in those particular centuries. But I do need to move on. So each chapter is specifically about what happened in that century. So I don't, bring I say baggage, but I don't bring everything that's happened before into each chapter, because if I did that, it'd be impossible to actually write the sort of book I'm trying to do at all. But I'm hoping, you set up the first chapter, life, death, and resurrection, and then, the beautiful in the first section, basically saying that the greatest beauty is given us at the beginning. And I hope that just stays with the reader in their memory as they then read read on as a point of context. Anyone else? Yes.
As you were talking about the tapestry of history, I was wondering what your thoughts are on the idea of the cyclical, like in the Canticle Liberates, where it's utter destruction, then slowly builds back up, then utter destruction, then mankind slowly. That idea of just it's happening over and over, is that idea, as a historian, something you would say, oh yes, that's how it is, or what's your thought on that cyclical idea?
Yeah, you were saying Leibowitz, I was thinking Oswald Spengler, but maybe but you took the better part. Well, of course, in the sense that this tapestry has a pattern. I talked about that weird woven web. That sanctity and sanity are ultimately synonymous, and insofar as sanctity is present, the world is a more sane, happier, more peaceful place. Insofar as it's absent, it's an uglier, more deadly, more decadent place. But within history, those threads are side by side. And not least in each individual human heart, including the human hearts of the saints, because as they will tell you themselves, they have this civil war between Homo Viator and Homo Suburbus, between good and evil, between the good and the bad in their very hearts. So there's a pattern there. But whether it's a cycle in the sense that, that we all move inexorably in this one direction, and then there's a collapse, and then we move again, and there's a collapse. I think you can possibly see those sort of patterns in history, but they're certainly not the predominant and most important one. The most important one is the interweaving of good, bad, and beautiful in every generation, and the good and the beautiful point to heaven, and the bad point to hell. Yes.
In the Brothers Karamazov, Dostoevsky says, in the end, beauty will save the world. I was wondering if you had any insight on that.
Well, the phrase "beauty will save the world" from Dostoevsky, I prefer it to the other one, but they're both problematic because they're too short to be definitive. So, the Keats's other famous saying that beauty is truth, truth is beauty, that's all you need to know. Well, yes, if you understand what beauty and truth is from the context of a Christian understanding of it, but no, if you think that beauty is something which is subjective and in the eye of the beholder and not in the thing beheld, then basically it means that you decide what's beautiful and you decide what's true. Well, that's radical relativism, and that's the root of much evil. So in other words, the phrase by Keats, it depends what he means by it. And beauty will save the world. Well, again, what do we mean by beauty? If by beauty do we mean beauty in its entirety, which in other words to encapsulate in itself the good and the true, in other words to see the good, the true, and the beautiful, the transcendentals as triune, then yes. But if somehow beauty is being used as something which is schismatic from the good and the true, as something separate from it, then no. So again, it really is what the phrase itself is a wonderful epigram, but it doesn't say enough to be definitive. That's the problem with it. Dr. Fahey, did you have a question?
Well, I know that we both have a friend in California who would be upset if you didn't mention that today's Columbus Day. So I'm thinking about Columbus Day. Not that long ago, Columbus Day was a day where most Americans thought about history. They thought about history. They thought about America deeply as a place where Christ was brought and understood the origins of civilization in the Americas as deeply rooted in Christian culture. This day is now maligned, if observed at all as Columbus Day, it's observed in a negative fashion. There are other replacement holidays that have been suggested. That's the preface. The question is it a little bit of both, or is it one more than the other? Is history, a sense of history eroded, and therefore people can no longer see this orientation towards Christ, from Christ? Or is it that they, for a variety of reasons, turn against Christ, and one of the consequences of that as a people is we then turn against all the manifestations of history? Because traditional history is, in one way or another, moving towards or moving away from Christ. Is it that Christ is rejected, and the consequence of that is we begin to fail understanding history? Or is it, for a variety of reasons, our ability to understand history means we're confused on the significance of Christ?
Well, there's manifold ways that I could respond to those comments and that question, but but there's two things I would say. First of all, from a not myopic, but maybe myopic perspective, we can see the way that things appear to be today. And the whole purpose of true history and the whole purpose of the book I've written, the manuscript I've written, is to allow us to see beyond that myopic understanding. In other words, from our perception of history that's rooted in our own particular zeitgeist. So the first thing I would say is that, that yes, it's absolutely true that the present culture mistrusts the past. It mistrusts the past because the past contradicts it. And the thing about ideology is it is absolutely dogmatically assured of its absolute truth, and everybody else is a dissident, and that includes the past. Chesterton said that that the future is a blank wall that you can write on whatever you like. So it's very easy to be progressive and think about the future and make the future what you want it to be. The past, on the other hand, is already full of lots of other people's writing, some of which is much more profound than anything you have to say. So it's much easier if you have a progressive understanding of things to just refuse to look at the wall with all the writing on it and just to write your ideological wokeness on the blank slate, the tabula rasa of the future. So I think there's a deliberate, willful ignorance of the past and a deliberate program of keeping people ignorant of the past in order to make the blank wall with the rather shallow, facile ideology believable, because there's nothing to measure it against. And that's one of the very important reasons for writing history books. But the other thing I would say is I don't believe that that history is ever a moving away from or moving towards Christ. I believe that the bad is always moving away from him, the good is always moving towards him, the beautiful is always moving towards him, and those three threads live in parallel in every single century. And that one good thing about doing what I've done from my own personal perspective is it allowed me to see that, in century-long segments, to get myself in a different zeitgeist, not my own, but the 5th century, the 7th century. And then you see this pattern. And there were periods of history where everything seems to be going to the dogs. And in some sense, they did. But they didn't stay there. So you get a period where 30 or 40 years, or even, best part of a century, things seem to have gone completely manic. Like the orders collapsed, the viciousness has triumphed. But you look at the whole thread, and, the following century, the good has made a restoration. The bad has destroyed itself. That's the thing. The good doesn't need to destroy the bad. The bad is always self-destructive. So this pattern, this tapestry, it plays its way out through all centuries. So, when I actually if I looked at the whole panorama now, this was a revelation to me, because I would not have been able to answer this question before writing the book. And if I had tried to write it, I would probably have got it wrong. But to ask myself the question, looking at the whole panorama of 2,000 years, when was the nadir? When was the lowest point with respect to, shall we say, the mystical body of Christ, the church? And I think, if you actually look at it, the worst date of all, now I'm doing the spoilers I said I wouldn't do, see, I'm now, what a hypocrite I am, that probably 1800. 1800, we had a period of absolutist monarchs who completely nationalised the church, nationalised the seminaries, and the state decided who would be ordained and what would be taught and what wouldn't be taught. The church was so weak it could do nothing about it anywhere, and the church was so weak that the Pope was basically coerced in his weakness to dissolve the Jesuit order. Basically at the behest and insistence of the secular power. And in 1800, Napoleon invaded Italy. The Pope was a prisoner. The French Revolution had just happened. The church was about as weak as it's ever going to get. If I was living in 1800, I'd be much more pessimistic than living in 2021. And yet, the 19th century saw revivals, all over the place. So the 1900, things were much better than they were in 1800. So, I don't think there's an inexorable tide going out or an inexorable tide coming in. I think that pattern plays itself out, and there's some particular parts, the black thread of the bad is particularly thick, 1800. But other times it gets thinner, and sanctity shines forth and beauty shines forth. And so that's what I've tried to sort of show in this book, is that history is that three-dimensional tapestry that runs through 20 centuries. It's not cyclical in the Leibowitz sense, and it's not this sort of oh my God, everything's going to go to hell, which means that the only possibility, the two possibilities, God doesn't exist or the apocalypse is inevitable. Right? I don't believe that. I don't think history shows that. Maybe one more question? Because I want to leave you time to spend loads of money. That's dangerous, like in an auction. You know, you can't go like that because I've got to expect a question from you. One final question. Going. Gone. I'll see you through the wardrobe. Thank you.